Star Wars are some of the most popular movies in the history of cinema, but there are some of their special effects that fans really hated. What did the movies look like without CGI? We'll check out some of your favorites and see how things changed. Which character would not have been possible without any CGI? And are they really better without CGI? Let's check it all out. How did they give effects in the original movie? The first movie, Star Wars: A New Hope, came out in 1977. There was for sure no computer-generated imagery available. In fact, there weren't even any visual effects companies around at the time. It seemed almost impossible to shoot a movie set in outer space to the scope that George Lucas had envisioned. But he wasn't going to let a little thing like that, not having the technology, stop him from making a legendary movie. So they created their own visual effects company called Industrial Light and Magic. It was going to change the movie industry forever. Like I said, CGI was not a thing back then, so they relied heavily on practical effects, but done in a way that no one could ever even imagine up to till then. They needed to find a way to create the incredible backgrounds of outer space, so to do that, they had to make matte glass paintings by hand that they can use to add into the scenes later. They relied heavily on models and other visual trickery to create the first three movies that really ended up being masterpieces of effects for the time that they were filmed in. That's why many people were upset when George Lucas went back and added CGI later on. There's still ways that you can see the originals, but adding CGI for the backgrounds, for example, really changed the feeling of them. How did things change by the time they made The Empire Strikes Back? Things had changed a little by 1980 when they started to film the second movie, but there was also a lot that still stayed the same. CGI, for example, wasn't much of an option just yet because it was still really expensive, and it didn't work great because it was also really slow. And despite the incredible success of the first film, the second still had loads of budget constraints. They couldn't just use whatever they wanted. Much of the film ended up relying heavily on some new cutting-edge blue screen processes. For example, when Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia are peering into space, they're just standing in front of a blue screen looking out. Much of the action doesn't actually include a lot of action, but they did an incredible job of making the film one of the best adventures of all time. Return of the Jedi has some incredible shots. How did they achieve them? By the time they started making Return of the Jedi in 1983, the visual effects artists at Industrial Light and Magic had started to make incredible strides in what they could achieve with effects. This movie had an entire puppet department to create some of the creatures that made the movies the hits that they ultimately were. There was even a creature shop that eventually created the Ewoks by hand and put them into the films. And then there was the speeder bike chase that was really intricate to film. It had loads of effects shots that needed to be shot in order to create the scene. 100 effect shots in total by the end of filming it, all just to create one scene. Most of it was done on a blue screen. That way they can use many of the background shots over and over again. Otherwise, a lot more shots would have been needed. The biggest challenge to the scene ended up being the front and rear shots of the bikes. They still needed to look like they were racing, so they couldn't be completely still. They had to figure out a way to make them look like they were bouncing. It was hard to achieve, but they did it in the end, and it was one of the biggest sequences of the movie. How do you feel about the first movies? Do you love the original versions where they just used the special effects that they had access to at the time? Or do you prefer the updated versions where they changed some of the shots to CGI? Let me know in the comments. There's still a lot to come, and we'll get into some of the biggest CGI shots of all time next. How do some of the modern films look without CGI? We'll check it out now. How did The Phantom Menace change the franchise? The movie still made use of the visual effects company that started it all, ILM, but they had so much more technology and ever more importantly, budget to work with at this modern era of Star Wars. The movie was a massive financial hit and made millions, but there were a lot of critics for the movie too, especially for one of the first CGI characters that has ever been created, Jar Jar Binks. People really couldn't stand him, but when it comes to the CGI that it took to create him, he was really impressive. When you check out the shots that it took to film Jar Jar Binks, you see a guy with a Binks costume and his face on top of his head. The original shots are actually pretty funny to see and might be less painful to watch for many Star Wars fans than the final scenes that made it into the movies. People just did not like Jar Jar Binks, but he did pave the way for many other CGI CGI created characters that would come later in cinematic history. The Phantom Menace also had loads of incredible fight scenes. Some, like the iconic fight between Darth Maul and Obi-Wan Kenobi and Qui-Gon Jinn, was even more intense to make. They created an entire blue screen set, so without the CGI that they added, it was just guys fighting on a set. Still pretty cool if you ask me. How was Revenge of the Sith record-breaking when it came to effects? Attack of the Clones started to really take full advantage of green screen technology and CGI, but it was really in Revenge of the Sith that Star Wars CGI went to a whole new level. They used the most effects shot yet, a mind-blowing 2,151 shots. Can you even imagine the amount of editing that went into the post-production editing? It had to have been huge. There was so much of the film that took place on the green screen that some of the scenes are almost unrecognizable, even for the actors who played these parts. The fact that a lot of the details for the movie wasn't decided when they were filming made it even harder. George Lucas only decided on some of the story later on, so they weren't always sure what they were filming exactly. But hard as it was, the fight scenes in Revenge of the Sith were some of the most iconic. But even more iconic, the CGI villain that was first introduced in the movie. General Grievous would become one of the most loved villains of Star Wars. Besides Darth Vader, of course. He's just so cool, don't you agree? But there were a lot of challenges in making him a person. He doesn't have a lot of features that can convey emotion, so they needed to use his arms much more. It worked, and he was a hit. How did The Force Awakens once again push the envelope? They kind of went back to their roots while still using CGI only when they needed to. In The Force Awakens, the effects department really wanted to use a lot of practical effects. That's why much of BB-8 was created with practical effects like puppets. This helped the actors because they could interact with him on set instead of just using their imagination and interacting with something that wasn't actually there. But this posed its own challenges since they had to remove the puppeteers that were working with the character later on in post-production. The original shots are much less magical when you see other people manipulate the character, but with some other characters in the movie, they weren't afraid to use digital tricks to help them come alive. Like with Maz, who was played by Lupita Nyong, who had to digitally create the character over the acting of the actors. She was fitted with motion capture sensors so she could later digitally change her features to Maz's without losing the emotion that she brought to the character. Without CGI, you still see a pretty impressive performance, but without the magic of the character that was seen in the film. How did they make the Voltex in The Last Jedi? A favorite species for many Star Wars fans, the Voltex was created by fitting a dog with a suit that had translucent drinking straws. They could watch him move, then they created a puppet to use in scenes and incorporated CGI to make him really come to life. Really using digital and practical effects together to the fullest to make this creature come to life on screen. Do you love the CGI in Star Wars? Would you prefer if they use more or less? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching.